The strange thing about horror games is that they're basically the only genre that we are eagerly interested in playing even when the main goal is far from having fun. Putting ourselves in a situation where everything is about fear and stress is not really something we do to enjoy our time. The feelings of suspense and curiosity are always enough to keep us interested and engaged until the end. The reason for this is that our minds simply love anything mysterious and unexplainable, and also love the idea of facing our deepest fears outside the real world. Horror stories and games present us with exaggerated versions of our anxieties, allowing us to confront them indirectly and perhaps even overcome them. But for some reason, whenever I realize that the fictional story in the game is somehow related to real life, even the fear gets replaced with enthusiasm and concern to know how, when, and where. Whether it's a horror movie, game, or book, our perspective changes completely once we discover that there's a connection between their stories and true events in the actual world we live in. I'm personally obsessed with this aspect, and I always try to find any link between a story in a horror game and the real world because it simply satisfies my curious mind and makes me see the game differently after understanding that it's not based on the developer's imagination. This is why I made multiple videos about this point before, showcasing the inspiration from real events that certain horror games have and people are not aware of. Today, I decided to dig deeper into this subject and talk about more games that actually have a plot related to true events that happened in the past. In certain cases, the inspiration is direct and clear, and in others, it's usually hidden between the lines, and the players have to figure it out themselves. So please don't blame me if I mention a certain example where it was not confirmed that it was influenced by a true story. As horror gamers, we love to come up with theories to satisfy our appetite for mysteries. So without further ado, let's start.
High altitude climbing. My brother, Frank Simmons, is one of the world's best. 3 days ago, Frank set out to climb Chomolunzo with a climbing partner, Paul Ward. He's still up there. Somewhere.
Cursed Mountain is a forgotten horror game that most people don't even remember. It came out 15 years ago for the Wii and PC, and it takes you on a perilous journey in the 1980s through Chomolunzo, a real mountain in the Himalayas. You play Eric Simmons, a mountaineer searching for his brother Frank, who disappeared while attempting to climb the peak. However, what awaits you is not just treacherous terrain and unforgiving weather, but also a dark curse that has unleashed malevolent spirits and monstrous creatures upon the mountain. It eventually turns out that Frank was hired by a spiritual leader to climb the mountain and get an item needed for a certain ritual, but he sadly died during the attempt. Eric went to the place to find his brother and save him, and even after he learns about his death, he remains hopeful because he's been told that his brother's spirit is stuck between life and death. Despite this hope, Eric, at the end, realizes that his brother is gone forever and feels some sort of guilt because of it. At first, this story seemed unrelated to anything in the real world, but the truth is that it was directly inspired by the true story of the two Italian brothers, Reinhold and Gunther Messner. Reinhold Messner was an iconic mountaineer who achieved an unprecedented achievement by being the first person to climb all 14 peaks above 8,000 meters without supplemental oxygen, and this includes Everest. He was known for his daring and often risky expeditions, pushing the boundaries of human endurance. Nevertheless, Reinhold was also one of the most controversial mountaineers in the world, and in a bad way too. Even though the extreme bravery can be praised at times, it was also one of his worst features. In some cases, he used to be reckless towards his partners in the expeditions and push them to the limit, even though they weren't as experienced as him. But sadly, Messner's attitude faced a shocking consequence in 1970. In that year, Reinhold was invited to a major expedition to climb the Rupal face of Nanga Parbat in Pakistan, and this mountain was never climbed at that time and remained an attractive challenge for every mountaineer. He attempted to climb the mountain with his brother Gunther, and they both actually succeeded in reaching the summit. But in a tragic twist, 24-year-old Gunther didn't survive the descent. He died due to an apparent avalanche that he couldn't resist, while Reinhold lost 7 toes because of the accident. Reinhold said that his brother was extremely exhausted when he reached the top because he was trying to catch up with him. He knew that going down would be very difficult for him because that mountain is known for being very dangerous to descend. They spent the night on top and waited for the morning, but Gunther started showing signs of altitude sickness. Both Reinhold and Gunther felt descending the mountain would be nearly impossible for him, yet they did it anyway, which eventually led to Gunther's devastating demise. Reinhold was criticized by the public for taking his brother with him on this challenge, especially since he knows that he's not as experienced as him. But regardless of the public, Reinhold himself was drowning in guilt because he felt like he had led his beloved brother into a situation where death was unavoidable. Cursed Mountain wanted to highlight this part of his life with the sad story of the fictional characters Eric and Frank, and even though it adds some supernatural themes to it, you can easily detect the unsettling journey of the two brothers, just like the one in real life.
Forward or backward, it is still possible for him to return to this life, to be reunited with his earthly body. But for him to do so, Eric, you yourself must enter the bardo, search for your brother, and help him to return.
Where the hell are you? Where are you?
Horror gamers can have different tastes and standards about the games they love, but one of the few games that almost all players can agree on how terrifying it is definitely Visage. It takes you into a weird realm of darkness as you play Dwayne Anderson, a man haunted by the tragic deaths of his wife and children in their old house. He's imprisoned behind the walls of the large abode, but the problem is that he is not really alone. Unseen entities, remnants of past tragedies, and the lingering echoes of memories torment him at every turn, and they never leave his head. The game is composed of multiple chapters where you experience the house through the lives of the different people who lived in the place before, each with their own perspective and connection to the tragic events that unfolded. The first chapter recounts the story of Lucy, a young girl in 1961 who became friends with a demon communicating through television and radio. The demon's influence led to Lucy's increasingly abnormal behavior. She killed her beloved bird, and her mental state collapsed completely until she eventually died in a disturbing way in the bathroom. The second story focuses on an elderly couple who lived in the same house in 1962 and had a baby. The wife displayed symptoms of mental disorders, including hearing her own voice through the baby monitor. Despite multiple remedies, her condition got worse, leading to increased mistrust and hostility towards her husband George. And in a tragic turn, she eventually murdered her husband by stabbing him with 7 knives, and later she put an end to her own life. The third chapter follows a 28-year-old man called Rakan who struggled with scopophobia, which is the excessive fear of being stared at, believing he was being watched all the time. His condition worsened when he moved to the house in 1970. He started screaming every night and throwing stuff everywhere, until the residents around him called the police, which subsequently led him to be confined to a psychiatric hospital. He was convinced that he was attacked by someone who broke into his home, and he was forced to defend himself with a gun. The police didn't find any evidence of such claims, and believed that he was suffering from intense paranoia. But after a while, doctors deemed Rakan to be recovering, leading to his official discharge. However, later on, he was mysteriously killed in a desolate chamber. The killer was never identified, which kind of proves that his hallucinations weren't as baseless as people thought. His death is not shown directly, but we can see how an unknown figure came to him and closed the door of the room before Rakan started screaming in pain. In all of these 3 chapters, Dwayne is the main character who witnesses all the events until you finally reach the 4th chapter, which is Dwayne's miserable story. You're probably wondering by now how the game's events are inspired by real-life stories in any way. Well, to be clear, the inspiration can actually be noticed when we recount multiple incidents that happened in history, not a single isolated event. The first incident is about Lucy, the young girl who got possessed by a demon in the 1960s and became violent before her tragic death. The game also shows how her parents tried every possible solution to help her without success. This situation looks very similar to the case of Anneliese Michael. Anneliese was a young German girl born in 1952, and she had a normal life until the age of 16, when she started having constant seizures and was diagnosed with psychosis, which is the mental condition of seeing things that other people don't see. She was also diagnosed with depression, and she went to a psychiatric hospital to seek treatment. However, as the years passed, her condition worsened even more, and she began to hear voices in her head. After 5 years of taking medication, her state did not improve, and her family came to believe she was possessed by a demon, and she herself believed this idea as well. The reason for this assumption is because she started experiencing strange behaviors that absolutely made no sense, including involuntary growling like animals and even speaking in foreign languages. Eventually, her parents decided to bring multiple priests to perform exorcism sessions on her, often lasting hours and documented on tape. But despite all the attempts, her well-being kept declining until she even stopped eating food and drinking water. She became more and more hostile, to the extent she was drinking her own urine and eating bugs. Sadly, Anneliese eventually died in 1976 due to extreme dehydration and malnutrition, because she wasn't consuming anything that could help her body survive. Her case became so controversial, and even if you didn't hear about her before, you probably watched the terrifying The Exorcist movie, which came out in 1973 and was directly inspired by her story. Even though we don't know for sure if Lucy in the game is inspired by the German girl's story or not, most of us can agree that the resemblance is very clear and should be stated even as a theory from a player. However, Lucy's story isn't the only one in the game that reminds us of real historic events. In fact, there's a relatively clear hint about the main character, Dwayne Anderson, which is the idea that he was involved in the MK Ultra program. Multiple scenes indicate that he has a background in chemistry and received money to secretly formulate psychoactive substances intended to contaminate the water treatment facility that he used to work for. And in case you're not familiar with the MK Ultra program, it was a real secret experimental program started by the CIA in the 1950s. Its goal was to develop drugs capable of inducing mind control and hallucinations, but the outcomes for the test subjects took a drastic and tragic turn. I actually explained it thoroughly in one of my previous videos, and I advise you to watch it if you haven't already. Anyway, the game indirectly suggests that the house where Dwayne resides was actually inhabited by residents who were affected by his chemical experiment. The water he contaminated caused their mental health to decline and ruined their minds. The clues around the house also show that Dwayne was an alcoholic, and even the radio broadcast indicates he killed his entire family. There is a belief that he has used on himself the same chemical substances he has employed on others, driven by feelings of shame and guilt. And obviously, he was affected by the same mental disorder, which resulted in him becoming violent and killing his family. Some theories also say that he was the one who killed Rakan because he thought that Rakan might expose his dirty secret. The game also leaves room to believe that the haunting entities might represent his own anguish and self-inflicted torment, which is a similar concept to the one in PT. Regardless of the exact inspirations behind the backstory, the game remains one of the most chilling and disturbing experiences you can ever go through.
I could help you with that, you know. I'm only with you because you have money. It's probably blood money, but I don't care. I don't care about you.
If
You want to die, I'll happily oblige. Do you want a rope?
Want me to kick the bucket? Want me to stab you
with 7 knives? Want me to rip the jaw off your ugly face?
How about I break both
Your legs and leave you to rot in a cellar?
You're a disgrace. People despise you. I despise you. Your children despise you.
Granny is one of the most popular indie games out there, and despite its casual visuals and concept, it's still considered a challenging game that can stress you a lot. It's a game where you find yourself stuck in an uncanny house with the goal of escaping the place before the creepy granny catches you. The storyline is minimalistic, but sets the eerie atmosphere for the gameplay, especially since the escape here is not as easy as you think. Anyway, regardless of the game mechanics themselves, the point of today's video is to discover the link between its concept and the real world. The inspiration can actually be detected by observing the character of the granny herself, which is such a bizarre character that most people won't think it's inspired by real figures. But if we look at history, we'll basically find that the concept of an evil old woman is something that can be found in many stories. However, the real world always proves that it's more horrifying than any type of fictional story we can read. In a previous video, I mentioned that there are 2 suspects who may be the source of inspiration for this evil character. The first one is a Russian woman called Tamara Samsonova, and she was born in 1947 in a small town close to Siberia. She was a successful linguist and translator, and she married a man called Alexei in 1971. Her marriage lasted 29 years before her husband mysteriously disappeared in the year 2000, and she began to suffer from mental health problems. After she became alone in her apartment, she started renting a room in the place for strangers. But on September 6, 2003, she got into an intense argument with one of her tenants, which led her to literally murder him. He was a 44-year-old man, and his body was then dismembered and thrown on the streets. Years later, Tamara moved to another city, and in March 2015, she met Valentina Ulanova, who was a 79-year-old woman living in the same street. One of their neighbors asked Valentina to shelter Tamara for some time because her apartment was undergoing renovation. Valentina agreed, and Tamara eventually moved to live with her. She lived there for months, and she was very helpful in the housework and cooking. However, Tamara loved staying there and didn't want to leave. This led her relationship with Valentina to collapse, and Valentina told her that she wanted her to leave. They had multiple aggressive arguments after this request, until Tamara finally decided to poison Valentina and get rid of her once and for all. She managed to convince a certain nurse to sell her a deadly drug, and then she put it on Valentina's favorite dish, which she made herself to seem friendly. On July 23rd, she found Valentina's body on the kitchen floor, and she decided to dismember it. As usual, she put the parts in plastic bags and threw them around the streets. Eventually, one of the neighbors discovered the bags and called the police to report the shocking scene. Law enforcement investigated the area until they finally watched the footage from the surveillance camera of the building. The disturbing footage shows Tamara casually carrying plastic bags and walking down the stairs. When the police went to her apartment, they found traces of blood in the bathroom, which confirmed the suspicion around Tamara. When the innocent-looking granny was arrested, the investigators discovered that she had a big history of crimes that went back decades. They believed that she actually killed 14 people between 2000 and 2015, and they even claimed that she might be the one who killed her husband. If you think Tamara seems like a very scary granny, then I can assure you that there's an even scarier one called Sofia Zhukova, which is my second guess to be the inspiration behind the game. Sofia was born in 1939 in a poor Russian village. She didn't receive any education, and she barely could read or write. Due to her strong structure, she worked as a laborer most of the time before she moved to another city, where she got married and had 2 sons. Sofia loved her husband so much, and that's why she started suffering mentally when he died in 2005. She became aggressive with her neighbors, even threatening them with violence, but none of them thought that an old woman like her would be a real threat. But little did they know that Sofia was actually a bigger threat than they could ever imagine. In the last months of the year, Sofia became very annoyed with the kids playing in the streets, and what made her even angrier was that they used to make fun of her when she yelled at them. One of the kids was an 8-year-old girl called Anastasia Alexenko. On December 14, 2005, Sofia lured Anastasia to her house by telling her she would give her candy. Anastasia went inside, and sadly, she will never be seen again after this. Sofia killed her with an axe, and she cut her body to pieces before putting it in bags and throwing it in the streets. When the residents of the apartment building found the remains, they were shocked, but no one suspected Sofia. None of them thought that the old woman would be capable of doing such a horrific thing. 8 years later, in March 2013, Sofia received a visit from her friend Anastasia Mihiva, who was 77 years old at the time. Anastasia told Sofia that she's going to stay at her daughter's house and talked extensively about her great relationship with her. Sofia was offended by this and felt that her friend was being arrogant with her, mainly because she doesn't have relatives who care about her. She was miserable because her 2 sons left her alone and forgot about her completely. She couldn't control herself, and she decided to kill her friend before dismembering her body and throwing her remains. When the police came to the house, they found traces of blood, but Sofia succeeded in fooling them by telling them Anastasia had a nosebleed. 6 years later, in January 2019, Sofia also used an axe to kill a janitor called Vasily Shliaktik, who used to rent her room. As usual, she threw his remains in bags, but this time she couldn't hide her tracks anymore. Police found out that the janitor was last seen in Sofia's house, and they managed to get her to confess to killing him, even though she claimed she did it in self-defense. However, during her time in jail, she told her cellmates that she had killed a little girl and a friend before. The inmates reported this to the officials, and Sofia eventually confessed to the 3 murders that started in 2005. She told them that she killed the little girl because she used to make a lot of noise and was disrespectful. But the most distressing part here is that Sofia used to literally cook some of the meat of her victims and eat it. Not only that, but she even makes meatballs and offers them to her neighbors. Some of the neighbors were in complete shock when they knew that the meat they were eating was basically human meat. Long story short, Sofia is basically the incarnation of what a real evil granny looks like, and the fact that she killed a child just because of noise makes the connection between her and the game seem even clearer. Even though she was apprehended in 2019 after the game's release, her name has actually started to become popular as the Granny Reaper since 2013, when she was suspected of committing her second murder. Anyway, regardless of whether she is the source of inspiration or not, she still proves to us that the real world is scarier than any kind of fiction.
Сколько раз нанесли ударов?
Раз, по-моему, 3.
От ваших ударов что произошло с ним?
С ним? Он упал и еще крякнул. Не видно, но я себя еще не видно. Я ничего не делал.
Пенсионерка имеет... Вот то, что пенсионерка имеет... Меня замучила маньяк.
Chucky the doll is one of the most popular horror figures of all time, and it's basically on the same level as Michael Myers. It first appeared in movies in the 1980s, but since then, it has been adopted in games, stories, and a variety of media. I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with the story. which focuses on how Chucky is not an innocent doll, and how he's basically a serial killer with no remorse. The plot again seems too weird to be real, but the concept of a dangerous, scary doll in history wasn't something that started with the movie. It's actually the movie that was inspired by real-life stories with this similar theme, and one of the most infamous stories is Robert the Doll. The name was not originally the name of the doll itself, but it's actually the name of its owner, Robert Eugene Otto. Robert was born in October of 1900, but his story with the doll started in 1906 when he was 6 years old. At that age, he received the doll as a birthday gift, but as time passed, his relationship with it became more deep than just playing and having fun. He developed an unusual attachment to the doll, treating it like a living companion, and he even built an entire room for it in the attic, complete with furniture and even a teddy bear. Their bond deepened even further until Robert started claiming that the doll would talk back and move on its own. As he grew older, his life took a dark turn, and he struggled with mental disorder, blaming the doll for his misfortunes. This is when the doll's malevolent spirit truly awakened. Whispers of strange occurrences began to swirl around the Otto household in Key West, Florida. Objects would move inexplicably, disembodied laughter would echo through the halls, and visitors swore they saw the doll's eyes follow them. Robert died in 1974, and his wife died 2 years later, but the doll's reign of terror continued. Subsequent owners reported similar unsettling experiences: furniture overturned, belongings hidden, and even physical attacks. One owner's daughter claimed the doll would change its facial expressions and whisper threats in her ear. Another reported waking up to find the doll perched on her chest and its eyes glowing in the darkness. The rumors say the doll has caused car accidents, broken bones, job loss, divorce, and other misfortunes. The situation kept getting scarier and more disturbing over time, until one family eventually decided to donate the doll to the Fort East Martello Museum in Florida. It's kept in a glass case for curious visitors who want to witness it, but no one is allowed to get closer. Even behind the glass, the staff claim they've seen the doll's eyes flicker, heard sounds close to the case, and witnessed bizarre occurrences befall visitors who disrespect it. The origin of the doll has also not been verified to this day. Some people say a girl from the Bahamas gave it to Robert, and others say that the former resident of the house was a witch and he left the doll for the kid. Whether the doll is really haunted or a product of a creepy urban legend remains a mystery. But one thing is certain: the story continues to captivate and terrify, solidifying its place as one of the most iconic and unsettling haunted dolls in the world. A place next to Annabelle, who's also considered one of the most dangerous haunted dolls in history.
Jean passed away, but some say that Robert's spirit lived on. Anne, who hated the doll, chose to lease their home rather than remain there, leaving the doll in the house forever, or so she thought.
In the lease, there was a clause that said Robert must remain the sole occupant of the attic room. And that's when weird things started happening. There were some people who rented their house out, and they'd hear moving around upstairs. They'd hear footsteps running back and forth, things moving around. They'd go up into the attic, and they'd find Robert had moved from one side of the room to the other.
Hey man, what are you doing? Hey! Move away from the body now!
The fuck is this?
Hey, did you hear me? My God. Hey, no!
Murdered Soul Suspect is a game that feels mysterious, despite being produced by a big studio like Square Enix. It was revealed in 2013 as an upcoming title for the next generation of consoles, the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, and it personally caught my eye like no other. It somehow felt different, unique, and interesting, but only for a very specific group of gamers. The events take place in Salem, Massachusetts, where a chilling pattern emerges and unconnected killings are carried out by a serial killer known as the Bell Killer. Detective Ronan O'Connor was searching for the killer, but somehow faced an intense confrontation. After being thrown from a window, his mortal journey abruptly ends. He was brutally murdered by the enigmatic serial killer, but the surprising part is that he finds himself stuck in the limbo between life and death. His physical form is gone, and the whispers of the dead become his only companions. However, Ronan gains some abilities in the process, including reading people's minds and even possessing their bodies. He found out that his only way out of this realm between life and death is to find out the identity of the murderer, the Bell Killer. He starts to investigate the place and the dark history of Salem, and eventually, he discovers that the Bell Killer is actually a young girl called Abigail Williams. And if you're aware of Salem's history in real life, then you are probably familiar with this infamous girl. This mysterious person is far from being fictional or something from the developer's imagination. Abigail Williams was born in 1681 in Massachusetts, which was then a part of colonial America. She lost her parents very early in her life, and she was living with her uncle Samuel Paris. At 12 years old, Abigail and her cousin Betty, along with several other young girls, started to experience weird behavior and supposedly supernatural phenomena. However, what looked like a bunch of little girls messing around and hallucinating eventually turned into one of the most tragic and painful events in Salem's history. As time passed, Abigail and her friends started to believe the idea that they were victims of witchcraft. But they didn't keep this idea to themselves, and they made sure everyone in the town knew about it. They started to accuse their neighbors of being witches, and even some of their relatives as well. And in case you didn't know, at that time, there were people called accusers, and they were required to find witches and start witch trials. The problem, however, is that proof and evidence weren't something that mattered a lot at that time. If some person accuses another of witchcraft, they're pretty much considered guilty until proven innocent. This is also because the government in that time used witchcraft as a justification to prosecute political opponents and protesters. Anyway, even though multiple girls were involved in the accusations, Abigail was a unique case of a sadistic person with a thirst for people's pain. She accused dozens of people in the town, and one of her first victims was a woman called Tituba, who was a slave from Barbados working at her uncle's farm. Tituba was accused along with two other women called Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, and they were interrogated separately. The three were completely stressed and started accusing each other in a moment of helplessness because they knew that the judge wouldn't believe their full innocence. What makes Abigail different from all the other accusers is the way she acts in court and presents the events in a convincing way that makes everybody believe her. She acts like she lost her conscience and says that she's been hunted by unseen spirits due to witchcraft by some of her neighbors. Eventually, hundreds of people were accused and imprisoned in what's now known as the Salem witch trials. And as the trials continued, more than 20 people were convicted and executed, including Sarah Good, whom I mentioned earlier. Sarah was executed along with 4 other women on the same day, July 19th. But before that, her co-worker, Sarah Osborne, died in prison in May. The disturbing part is that Abigail Williams was happy and excited to see all these people suffer and get punished for actions they didn't even commit. It somehow gave her satisfaction, as if she had personal hard feelings towards those accused individuals. But after a year of trials, the accusations from the girls started to feel less and less serious, and the governor of Massachusetts began to give orders to end this mess. Many people paid their jail fees and got out, but Salem's residents felt like there were many wrongful accusers among them. After the witch trials officially ended, Abigail ran away from her home and left the entire city, and she literally disappeared from history. Her location after the events is unknown. Her life afterwards is not confirmed, and her fate in general is a mystery that historians can't solve to this day. Some people suggest she was killed by authorities after her lies were exposed. Others suspect she might be killed by her neighbors, while some believe she changed her identity and escaped far away. The motivations behind her actions were also never discovered. The most popular theory claims that she did all of this for revenge because of what happened to her in her childhood. Her parents were both killed in an attack on their home by locals, and she barely survived as a child. Her life with her uncle was also full of abuse, mistreatment, and misery, which probably made her hateful toward humanity and want to see others suffer too. Regardless of the actual reasons, we will never know for sure, and it will always remain a mystery that teases our curiosity forever. The only thing we know for a fact is that Salem's witch trials remain one of the darkest chapters of the city's history, and they played a big role in inspiring creators to make movies and games about them. Murdered Soul Suspect recreates the eerie setting of the 1690s, but with a modern touch.
The time is upon us, Abigail Williams.
No.
You scourge of Salem. It is time to pay for your sins!
This can't be happening. You want to use memories against me? Two can play at that game.
The history of Abigail as an accuser is seen in the game, and even the protagonist Ronan himself was one of the wrongfully accused in the modern world. Tell me in the comments what you think happened to Abigail in real life. Do you believe that she survived and lived her life elsewhere, or that she was simply killed, just like her victims?
I wasn't close to the truth in the apartment. I wasn't one of your killers. Why did I have to die? You made me kill her.
This is all for today, and I believe the video shouldn't be longer than this. The reason it took this long is because I wanted to explain the events deeply so you could understand how they influenced the games. The purpose here is to prove how real life can actually be a bigger source of horror stories than the imagination of any developer. Even if the inspiration is not direct, I wanted to show how most of the ideas you see today in horror games were actually something that happened before. Anyway, let's end it here, and until next time, stay safe and don't push yourselves too hard.